So I did a live stream recently, last night, as I'm recording this, where I talked about a video about German National Socialism, and recommended on the suggestions bar was another video somebody made, something titled like Oswald Mosley, Great Britain's Failed Hitler. And I took exception to this title because I don't see Oswald Mosley as being very much like Hitler at all. Even though he was, in some ways, playing the same role as Hitler, and he definitely was a lot friendlier to Hitler than other people of his time and place. Now, I don't claim that Oswald Mosley was any kind of a saint on race relations or anti-Semitism. He certainly wasn't, and we'll get into that in a minute. But one of my big reasons for taking exception to this is that I think there's a hypocrisy at play when we look at Winston Churchill, the man who fought Hitler. Because Winston Churchill was pretty much every bit as racist and anti-Semitic as Oswald Mosley. And in fact, I think Mosley might have been a tad bit more anti-Semitic than Churchill, but Churchill was definitely more racist than Oswald Mosley, in my opinion. And so my evidence for this comes from a podcast called Cam and Ray's Cold War Podcast. It's a very good podcast. I highly recommend it. But one of their earliest episodes was about Winston Churchill, and they go into detail about Winston Churchill's history of consistent racism, anti-Semitism, and even fascism. Winston Churchill was even a fascist sympathizer before Oswald Mosley ever entered that fray. So I'm going to play for you the relevant clips from that podcast about Churchill, and that'll cover the Churchill stuff. And then we can talk a little bit about Mosley and what he wrote in his 100 Questions pamphlet, and then discuss, compare and contrast the differences and similarities between these two men.
Really is a war correspondent, but in 1897, age 23, he went to the Swat Valley, which is now part of Pakistan. Back then it would have been part of the British Indian Empire, to fight an insurrection by local Indian tribes. Obviously, India was part of the Great British Empire. I mean, great in terms of huge, not in terms of, wow, that's awesome.
It was the crown jewel of the British Empire.
He wrote that these Indian tribes that were obviously trying to kick off the shackles of British occupation were merely deranged jihadists whose violence were explained by a strong Aboriginal propensity to kill. He also wrote about his own time there. We proceeded systematically, village by village, and we destroyed the houses, filled up the wells, blew down the towers, cut down the shady trees, burned the crops, and broke the reservoirs in punitive devastation. I want you to remember this. When we get to the section on Stalin and Stalin killing his own people and his brutality amongst anyone who didn't agree with his vision of the Soviet Empire, I want you to remember that, albeit Churchill's a young man at this point, as Stalin was during the revolution. But Churchill was more than happy to get in there and kill and destroy the villages of anyone who resisted the British Empire, anyone who resisted the white man rule. He was more than happy to go in and crush. He then sped off, I think the next year, to help reconquer the Sudan from Islamic freedom fighters, again trying to throw off the shackles of the British Empire. In his writings about that, he bragged that he personally shot at least 3 savages, as he called them.
Yep, right.
In 1902, a couple of years later, he was fighting in the Second Boer War in South Africa against the Dutch and the local black population. He later wrote about his irritation that kaffirs should be allowed to fire on white men. I think it's very irritating that kaffirs should be allowed to fire on the white men. Now, around about the same times, the Kurds. Now, we know that the Kurds have been oppressed by lots of people in the 20th century. Saddam Hussein gets a lot of criticism, justified, for killing the Kurds. Well, the Kurds rebelled against British rule. Churchill at the time, his view on it was, I am strongly in favour of using poisoned gas against uncivilized tribes. It would spread a lively terror.
Wow.
Now, they didn't actually use the gas. The government went, shut the fuck up, Winston. What? Where? Who let him in? Get out of here, Winnie. Now, his apologists say, well, he was really referring to tear gas here, not mustard gas.
Right.
So it's not really going to kill them. It's just going to, make them very uncomfortable. Better than killing them. Okay.
I would just like, just real quick, the tear gas is the gateway drug to the other types of gas. That's all I want to say.
The point is that the Kurds, again, rebelling, wanted self-determination, and Churchill was all for crushing them with poison gas. He does, later on, authorise real lethal poison gas, so don't be worried about that. He was the gateway drug. He started going, gas, hey?
It worked, yeah.
Around about this time also, he played a significant role in creating Israel. The Balfour Declaration was out. His role as colonial secretary was to go over and start to organise how that was actually going to play out. But he seems to have privately held racist contempt for both the Zionists and the Arabs.
An equal opportunity, yeah.
Later on, he said the Palestinians were barbaric hordes who ate little but camel dung.
Ouch.
While he was appalled that the Zionists took it for granted that the local population will be cleared out to suit their convenience.
Wow.
Now, that's an interesting quote from Churchill in the 1920s for those, particularly our Jewish and Israeli listeners. Barry Morris, I'm thinking of you, who like to argue with me that there was nothing, no one was living in Palestine when the Zionists turned up. And even if there was anyone, then it was never their intention, the Zionist intention, to kick them out. They just sold it to them legally. It was all good. It was all friendly. Here's Churchill in the 1920s saying that the Zionists take it for granted that the local population will be cleared out to suit their convenience. So that's a bit of... we'll get to Israel later on, I'm sure. On addressing the Peel Commission in 1937, much later on why Britain was justified in deciding the fate of Palestine, Churchill, displaying his white supremacist ideology, said that the Aryan stock is bound to triumph.
Ooh.
Sound familiar, Ray?
Yeah, a bit.
Yeah. Now, if I said to you that a political leader in the late 1930s, a European political leader, justified genocide and the mass displacement of people based on his belief that the Aryan stock is bound to triumph.
Yeah.
Now, who would you have guessed I was talking about?
Would not guess Churchill. Would not.
At the same time, at the Peel Commission, Churchill said the following: I do not agree that the dog in a manger has the final right to the manger, even though he may have lain there for a very long time. I do not admit that right. I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more worldly wise race, to put it that way, has come in and taken their place.
Old school. Yep.
And then somebody said, so why should the Jews have Israel? Well, they were there before. Hold on a second. You just said that.
Yeah.
Now, although I don't want to position him as being an anti-Semite or even anti-Zionism, in 1920 he wrote an article called Zionism versus Bolshevism, which is a fascinating read. He kind of says, look, there are three kinds of Jews. There are the Jews that live in England or anywhere else, and they behave like British gentlemen, and that's fine. They've assimilated, basically, and, I've got nothing against assimilated Jews.
Good on you.
You have the Zionists, who want to, get back their homeland, then they're okay too. But then you've got a third kind of Jew, what he called the international Jew, and he blames the international Jew for much of the world's problems.
Oh, my God.
1920, Ray.
Oh, my God.
Somebody else was blaming Jews for the world's problems.
So, Cam, if I said to you, name me a person in the 1920s who blamed the world's problems on the Jewish people.
Ooh, let me see. Let me go down a list of probable people there, Ray.
No.
Let me read this quote. See if you can get. We should play, Hitler or Churchill. Just read quotes and see if people can tell who it was, man. This is the quote from the article that I mentioned. This worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization and for the reconstitution of society on the basis of arrested development, great TV show, by the way, of envious malevolence and impossible equality has been steadily growing. It played, as a modern writer, Mrs. Webster, has so ably shown, a definitely recognisable part in the tragedy of the French Revolution. It has been the mainspring of every subversive movement during the 19th century, and now at last this band of extraordinary personalities from the underworld of the great cities of Europe and America have gripped the Russian people by the hair of their heads and have become practically the undisputed masters of that enormous empire. Although in all these countries there are many non-Jews, every whit as bad as the worst of the Jewish revolutionaries, the part played by the latter in proportion to their numbers in the population is astonishing. He also, by the way, in this article, said that he thought the Jews were going to lead to the downfall of Germany.
Only if.
And played a large role in World War I. Now, hello, really? Now, I can already hear the apologists out there going, well, but he didn't throw them into concentration camps and he didn't, and okay, fair enough. Okay, that is true. But in large part, that invasion of Bolshevik Russia that I mentioned before was because he didn't like the Jews. He didn't like the Jews that wanted a revolution. So, definitely maybe not completely anti-Semitic there, but at least half anti-Semitic. I don't know how you classify that. He was like, I'll give you an example. He was like someone from Virginia saying, I don't like the niggers, but, Bill Cosby, he's okay. He got, I don't, they make something of themselves. Yeah, they make something of themselves. I don't mind the niggers that make, like the Michael Jordan. He's okay. But the rest of them niggers, the ones that, they want equality. They want, they don't want to be slaves. They want to end the segregation. Then Martin Luther King's, don't like them niggers. That's basically
Uncle Joe. Was that you?
That's my Winston Churchill impersonation with a redneck American accent for some reason.
Felt good at the
and
moment.
We'll get into this more later, but again, I can hear the apologists.
It's a very common thing.
Yeah, the apologists will say, look, that Churchill was just like everyone else of that era. And look, here's my thing on that. A, that's not even true. And I've got quotes from his contemporaries that were like, fucking Churchill, man, like he's crazy. And B, it's interesting when people use that as an excuse for people they want to like. You don't hear anyone say, well, Hitler, look, it was a product of his time that people didn't like Jews back then. You can't judge him based on 21st century morals. Like, he was no different to anyone. People use that apologetics in a very hypocritical fashion. They use it to justify one person, but they won't,
Because they're humans. We're all humans.
Yeah, exactly. More. Let's keep going. More Churchill. So in 1927, he went to Rome, met Mussolini. Afterwards, he wrote, "What a man! I have lost my heart. fascism has rendered a service to the entire world. If I were Italian, I am sure I would have been with you entirely from the beginning of your victorious struggle against the bestial appetites and passion of Leninism.
Yeah.
Now, you made this point before that he could see and he had vision, and people often say, oh, well, he saw before anybody else what a bad thing fashion was. No, he fucking didn't. Maybe a little bit before, but you go back to the late 20s, he loved fascism. He thought fascism was the fucking bomb.
Well, to me, at that point in his life, he reminds me of Reagan. Yeah, you might be a fascist or whatever, but if you're against communism, you are suddenly my man. And so for me, I think that's part of the context. When he goes against Hitler, it's because he truly reads Mein Kampf. He reads the English version of that when it comes out. So for Mussolini at this point, to me, it's like, okay, you're against communists. You're my man. I'll go with you all the way. For Hitler, it was truly based on what he wanted to do if he ever came to power. But I see your point.
Little known fact that Churchill actually wrote a song about Mussolini around about this time. Yeah, it was quite good. I'm a big fan of it. Had a big intro.
That's what she said.
There's a brand new political movement, I don't know its name, that people from bad homes are joining again and again. I should have worked on this a bit more. It's big and it's scary, full of tension and fear. They do it over there, but we don't do it here. Fascism, fascism, we're on the right. Ooh, fascism. We've got a goon squad and we're coming to town. Bang, bang. Fuck me, I could almost say that Bowie wrote that song about fascism and changed it at the last moment.
I knew it. Yes. Yeah.
On the subject of India, said the British Secretary of State to India, Winston is not quite sane. I don't see much difference between his outlook and Hitler's.
Ouch.
This is getting back to this point. People say, well, everyone thought that way. No, they didn't. Really, they didn't. According to John Charmley, who wrote a book called Churchill and the End of Glory, Churchill certainly believed in racial hierarchies and eugenics. In his view, white Protestant Christians were at the top.
The best, Jerry, the best.
Oh, that is so good.
Thank you. I love Seinfeld.
Oh, I love you on you. What's that guy's name? Oh, shit.
What's
his name? Banya.
Yes.
The best, Jerry, the
two
best.
Lunches. 2 dinners. No, 1 lunch, 1 dinner. You pay. No, you pay. Dutch. Okay, deal. Oh, my God.
It's gold, Jerry. Gold. In Churchill's view, the white Protestant Christians were at the top. Just below them are the white Catholics. Indians were higher than Africans. Churchill, and I don't know where the Jews were, but Churchill saw himself and Britain as being the winners in a social Darwinian hierarchy, according to Charmley. Now, people may not know this, but when Mahatma Gandhi launched his campaign of peaceful resistance, Churchill said that Gandhi ought to be laying bound hand and foot at the gates of Delhi and then trampled on by an enormous elephant with the new viceroy seated on its back. When Gandhi was fasting, Churchill told cabinet, Gandhi should not be released on the account of a mere threat of fasting. If he dies, we should be rid of a bad man and an enemy of the empire. Again, going back to Chalmers, the author of this book, I got a quote from him. He says, Churchill was very much on the far right of British politics over India. Even to most conservatives, let alone Liberals and Labour, Churchill's views on India between 1929 and 1939 were quite abhorrent. Churchill was basically the Donald Trump of England in the 20s and 30s.
I was going to say he's a Briton with a capital B, but you took it even further. So okay, you win that.
Yeah.
With a capital W.
Release Roger. Going to get back to Chalmers quotes. People sometimes question why on earth did people not listen to Churchill's warnings about Hitler in the late 1930s, to which the short answer is that he'd used exactly the same language about Gandhi in the early 1930s.
Yeah, it's all context. It's all context.
See, this is, people have this soundbite view of Churchill that they've picked up over the years. Oh, wonderful man, wonderful man. They should have listened to him. Should have listened to him about Hitler. But, his own contemporaries were like, Churchill's fucking crazy, man. Keep him away from the keys. Don't let Churchill drive, man. Yeah,
exactly. They did not want him in power. But it's so true. If you end your career or whatever you want to call it on a high note, all the stuff you did before seems to get whitewashed, and he's a good case study for that, but more on that later.
Churchill again said around this time, I hate Indians. They are a beastly people with a beastly religion. Now, people might say, okay, well, he talked a lot of shit and he was obviously a douchebag, but at least he didn't kill them. Well, he kind of did. A bit, yeah. I mean, sort of indirectly, though. He didn't throw them into concentration camps, although there were concentration camps in South Africa after the Boer War that he was quite a big fan of, but I didn't want to focus on that. It wasn't under his management. He was just a young guy.
Right.
He thought they were wonderful, though. Lovely. Love a good concentration camp. Throw the darkies in there. Lovely. So in 1943, so in the middle of World War II, or towards the end of World War II, I guess, a famine broke out in Bengal, which was still run by the Brits. The famine was, at least in part, caused by British policies over the previous few years. There'd also been droughts and bad harvests and that kind of thing. But Churchill had ordered a build-up, a stockpile of wheat for the feeding of European civilians after they had been liberated.
Right.
So 170,000 tons of Australian wheat didn't go to India, where they were starving. It went into storage for the white people of Europe. Because, you got a choice. You can feed the white people or you can feed the darkies. I mean, really, it's not even,
Right.
It didn't even stop and think about it. 3 to 4 million people starved to death in India, while British officials, other British officials and Indians begged Churchill to direct food supplies to the region. They knew what was coming. Churchill bluntly refused. He wittily replied, if food is scarce, why isn't Gandhi dead yet?
Oh, didn't like him.
He also said, relief would do no good. Indians breed like rabbits and will outstrip any available food supply. At other times, he said the plague was merrily culling the population. Yeah. I saw some photos, by the way. There are photos of this. Imagine the photos of Dachau or Auschwitz.
Right.
Just those corpses, lying there, but just spread out in streets and in cities. There is a lot of photographic evidence of the famine. Imagine 3 to 4 million people lying dead from starvation in cities, women, children, men, animals. That is on Churchill. I mean, okay, he was fighting a war. But, and when they started to die in their millions, he did end up getting food in there. So it could be done. He just chose not to do it.
Right.
I'm sure there are levels of complexity in that we're skimming over here, but, the point remains.
Yeah. Could have started a lot sooner. Yep.
Yeah, and British officials were urging him to do it, and he refused. It's not like they didn't know. Oh, well, we didn't know. Yeah, we knew.
Yeah.
Later on in his post-war premiership, the Kenyans fought back against the British. The British believed, and Churchill believed, that Kenya's fertile highlands should be the preserve of white settlers. I wanted to clear out the local blackamoors, as he referred to them. He referred to the local Kikuyu tribe as brutish children. 150,000 of them, under Churchill's premiership, were forced at gunpoint into detention camps. A Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, Professor Caroline Elkins, later referred to them as Britain's Gulag. So here we have concentration camps run under Stirling, Starlill, Churchill's leadership. So, when we talk about the moral superiority of Churchill, just, have a think about that. 150,000 Kenyans forced at gunpoint into detention camps. And this is getting back to the reason why President Obama, whose grandfather was one of those Kikuyans, didn't really want Churchill's bust staring at him in the White House.
I would imagine not.
In 1954, when asked about a visit to China, Churchill replied, "I hate people with slit eyes and pigtails. I don't like the look of them or the smell of them."
Damn.
And in 1955, he told the cabinet that "Keep England White" was a good slogan.
Oh, wow. Okay. Not on a bumper sticker, please.
So, not just when he was a young man was he a racist douchebag. Even towards the end of his life, he was a completely racist douchebag. So that is a side of Churchill that you may find shocking. But, I also just want to finish up with a few things here. Other people who didn't think that way at the time, Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin was warned by cabinet colleagues not to appoint Churchill because his views were so antediluvian, meaning before the flood or backwards. Even his doctor, Lord Moran, later wrote in his memoirs that Winston thinks only of the colour of their skin. Look, there's a lot of contemporary accounts of people thinking he was extreme, a racist, crazy, but, good wartime president. I think somebody said, I don't know if I have this quote somewhere, but somebody said earlier on, "We never want to see Churchill as prime minister unless we're in a war."
Yeah.
Because he loved war. He loved war.
He loved everything about it.
And he reminds me of Napoleon in that sense, and Caesar and Alexander. These are guys who loved war. They loved being in command. They loved the details. They loved the strategy and the tactics. Churchill, even though he wasn't a professional military guy, from a very early age loved the galloping around and killing the barbarous savages.
Yeah, pretty bad stuff, huh? Well, let's compare him to Mosley. Let's read from Mosley's 100 Questions. Now, this is his view on religion. He says, "We believe in complete religious toleration. The fascist attitude is well summarized by the Christian precept, 'Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's.' We are concerned with the business of the nation, not with the business of religion. None of the great religions preach the subversion of the state, and therefore they have no conflict with fascism. On the contrary, we welcome religion which inculcates a sense of service and of spiritual values, for service and the values of the spirit are the essence of fascism." Okay, so we didn't get a whole lot of religious bigotry from Churchill in those quotes, but we did hear him disparage Hinduism as a barbaric religion. It doesn't seem that Mosley held the same view, and it doesn't seem that Mosley had any issue with the Jewish religion as such. But we will see more that Mosley did have issues with the Jewish race, I guess we could call them. But we'll see that in a minute. This is what he has said on Indian culture. Now, we remember Churchill absolutely hated Indians, and he hated Gandhi. Now, Mosley actually met Gandhi back in the 1920s and had a certain amount of respect for Gandhi. So that's one area where we can say that Mosley was more based than Churchill. But here we go. We will certainly attempt the education of the Indian masses, but not on Western lines. The mistake has been the imposition of Western culture on Oriental life. Indians should be taught a higher ambition than to be a pale imitation of the West. The best minds of India will be only too willing to cooperate in that conception. It is a tragedy that Indians with an older cultural tradition than our own should merely seek to imitate our failures, such as parliamentary institutions. Discontent arises from this inefficient imitation fostered by Western parliamentarians and academic ideologues. Fascism teaches pride of race and racial culture. Under fascism, Indian leaders will arise to carry forward their own traditions and culture within the framework of empire and the modern world of science. So, interesting line here. It's interesting that, he talks about that the Indians having an older culture than the West, and that it's it's almost like he's implying that Indians have a superior culture than the West, although that's not what he's saying. Definitely a far cry from Churchill's racist views on India. I wouldn't even necessarily say I agree with it, though, because I think that I kind of think that India was right to mimic the West in the ways that they did, such as parliamentary institutions. That might be better than, I don't know, the caste system that they had before. That wasn't great, was it? There's a weird way here in which he's being like both more progressive and also less progressive by supporting Indian culture. It's very strange. Now, these are his views on race mixing and the German Nazi race ideology. They are German and we are English. Therefore, our views and our methods on many subjects will be different. In this particular, that's a weird phrasing, in this particular, we possess a great empire comprising many different races. They possess no such empire, and their aim is a revived German race, geographically united. We believe profoundly in our own British race, which has created the empire, but we know also it would be bad for the empire to stigmatize by law other races within it as inferior or outcast. We have created that empire without race mixture or pollution, by reason of the British social sense and pride of race. That is an achievement unique in history, and we can trust the British genius in this respect in the future as in the past. It should not be necessary to secure British racial purity by act of law. It should only be necessary by education and propaganda to teach the British what racial mixtures are bad. If a Briton understands that some action is bad for his race, he will not do it. With the British, this is a matter for the teacher rather than the legislator. But if legislation was ever necessary to preserve the race, fascism would not hesitate to introduce it. Okay, so again, we have this weird kind of like half-based and then half fucking crazy racist. It's very strange, the kind of mixture. It's a very British fascism, isn't it? So like, obviously he's saying that race mixture is bad, which is pretty racist. But then he's saying, no, we need full legal equality between the races in the empire. And we shouldn't outlaw race mixing just because we don't happen to like it. It's a very interesting combination of views there. But he also says if race mixing becomes a problem, a big enough problem, then they will use legislation to stop it. Interesting. Now, we didn't really get any of Churchill's views on race mixing. We just got a lot of his personal animosity toward other races. And we did get that part where he was complaining that the black people were allowed to kill white people in the Boer War, which is, that's kind of him wanting races to be treated differently, isn't it? Next we have immigration. All immigration will be stopped. Britain for the British is our motto, and all of Britain is required for the British. Further, all foreigners who have already been naturalized will be deported unless they have proven themselves valuable citizens of Great Britain. So yeah, this idea of deporting all naturalized foreigners is, not very based, is it? That's kind of mean, isn't it? Like you're just ripping those people away from their new homes. Now, one thing to note is that Mosley viewed Jewish people as foreigners, and so this also applied to Jews. Speaking of Jews, we have a lot of comments, not necessarily in passages about Jews. We have comments about other things, but then he always brings up the Jews without failing. He says, Roosevelt's New Deal is an attempt to plan without the power to plan. Further, the New Deal employs the instrument most opposed to the organized state because it battens upon economic anarchy, namely Jewish finance. On Jewish finance, he goes on to say, not only the Bank of England and the joint stock banks will be subject to the corporation, but also the finance houses. It is noteworthy that the Socialist Party do not include in their scheme the finance houses, which are responsible for most foreign banking. The reason is not only that they are largely Jewish, but also that they can break any government pursuing international economic policy by breaking the exchange. Why do you suggest that present governments so favor the foreign importer? Because democratic governments are in the grip of international finance, which, in this respect, is largely Jewish. The great finance houses of the city have made loans to foreign countries. Even when they have handed these loans on to the public, they make a substantial annual income by acting as fiscal agents for foreign countries in the distribution of interest. This annual interest on foreign loans is not paid in foreign money, it is paid in the shape of foreign goods, like beef from the Argentine. This accounts for the fact that a country like the Argentine sends us far more goods each year than we send her. If we exclude foreign goods, we exclude the interest on the loans made by the city. We have to choose between the producer and the city, and fascism chooses the producer. The old parties choose the city, not only because they are in the grip of Jewish finance, but because it rests in the power of the city to bring down any government dependent on international trading, as explained in the answer to question 47. The farmer will never be free until he has broken the power of Jewish finance.
Cool it with the anti-Semitic remarks.
And then this is his comments on chain stores. Chain stores owned by Jewish and foreign capital will be eliminated. Their staffs will be absorbed in the extended cooperative system to which reference is made in the previous question. Chain stores which are British-owned will be permitted only under license, and to an extent which does not interfere with the fascist system of small shopkeeper and cooperative society. Fascism will not tolerate the growing monopoly of the people's vital supplies in alien hands. So there he is, lumping the Jew and the foreigner together and wanting to treat the Jews differently than the Gentile population of Britain, even if they are British Jews. Then we get more comments on the Jews specifically. Jews must put the interests of Britain before those of Jewry or be deported from Britain. This is not a principle of racial or religious persecution. Any well-governed nation must insist that its citizens owe allegiance to the nation, and not to co-racialists and co-religionists resident outside its borders or organized as a state within the state. The Jews as a whole have chosen to organize themselves as a nation within the nation, and to set their interests before those of Great Britain. They must, like everyone else, put Britain first or leave Britain. Now, this is very interesting because he's making it very clear that he is not racist against Jews, and he's not offended by the Jewish religion. Those two are not his issues. His issues are with Jewish national identity. He dislikes Jews identifying nationally as Jews. And because of this, he's willing to discriminate against Jews because they, on the whole, have conformed to this stereotype that he has against them. So this is an interesting form of anti-Semitism that is not racially based. It is not religiously based. It is culturally based. He doesn't like this one element of Jewish culture. And he thinks that it is such a problem that he wants to get rid of it. And then it extends in his mind, I guess, to their sort of weird kind of tentacle grasp on financial politics that he's been alluding to constantly throughout this book, but he doesn't exactly make it clear how that intersects with this idea, other than to say that Jewish people value their own interests over the interests of the nation, and that means having these international finance networks that benefit them at the expense of the nation. So this is actually very similar to Churchill's views on Jews. I guess the difference would be that Churchill wasn't talking about deporting anyone. And I guess if we're talking about deportation, it would be to somewhere else in the empire. Like maybe, I don't know. I don't know where they could put them. But, they could put them somewhere because they had a huge empire. I'm assuming that's the kind of deportation they were talking about. One that wouldn't require them to go through another country's customs and immigration. But then he follows it up with a question, a question that I'm sure was on everyone's mind reading it. Is not this hard on the minority of Jews who put Britain first? And he says, minorities always suffer from the faults of the majority. Races as a whole suffer from the mistakes of the majority of the race when a mistaken policy is pursued. Such Jews would certainly not be molested, let alone persecuted. But they can no more complain of suffering from the errors of Jewry as a whole than members of any other nation can complain of suffering from the mistakes of the majority and the blunders of its government. Now, the issue with that is that the Jews don't have their own government. So, yeah, he's basically advocating for a persecution of this minority based on the grounds that, oh, well, you can't complain because, if your government does, well, they don't have a government. So what are you talking about? They're British. They're living in Britain. They're under your jurisdiction. Same jurisdiction as you. And then he says, will the Jews then be persecuted or ill-treated? It is untrue to suggest that Jews will be persecuted under fascism in Britain. Bullying or persecution of any kind is foreign to the British character. We shall not keep Jews here to bully them. Those who have been guilty of anti-British conduct will be deported. Those against whom no such charge rests will be treated as foreigners, but in accordance with the traditional British treatment of foreigners within these shores, will not be ill-treated or molested. On the other hand, foreigners who have not proved themselves worthy citizens of Britain will be deported. There's this sort of like litmus test that you have to go through. You have to prove yourself worthy, and it's not made clear what exactly that will entail. But if you have proven yourself worthy, you can't be naturalized as a citizen. You can only be seen as a foreigner. So this is obviously problematic, and it's unclear exactly how far this goes. Like, is this an ancestry thing? Is it a religion thing? Like, what exactly defines you as Jewish under these stipulations? And he says, will they be allowed the right of citizenship or permitted to be officials or MPs in the fascist state? As stated above, the Jews have deliberately maintained themselves as a foreign community in Britain, setting their racial interests above the national interest. As such, therefore, they will be treated, and none can complain of treatment which accords with their own actions. We do not permit foreigners to be MPs or officials or afforded the full rights of British citizenship, and Jews will not be afforded these privileges. Anyone in the service of the state under fascism must be entirely British. So there he is. He's saying even Jews who are Britain first Jews will never be entirely British, which doesn't really make any sense. So on the whole, I would say that Mosley had a much more conciliatory view on these issues of like race relations and stuff like that. He seemed to have a really antagonistic relationship with the Jewry, and much more so than Churchill ever did, although Churchill, obviously, as we've covered, had his own issues with anti-Semitism. I would say that Churchill was far more bigoted than Mosley, personally. But I think that the circles that Mosley walked in as a politician made it necessary for him to pay some lip service to these sorts of racial values, like when he talks about miscegenation, he talks about race mixing. But it does seem like he wanted it to be clear that he wasn't looking for a white supremacist state. That was not his vision of fascism at all. That he wanted the empire to be a multi-ethnic empire, and for each ethnicity to be respected within that empire, except, of course, for the Jewry. Which, of course, is different from Churchill, who seemed to have a much more overtly white supremacist view of empire, and wanted to put the Aryan white race above the inferior dark races. So that should give you some perspective on this issue. How when we call Mosley the British Hitler, and then ignore all of his statements about how he was in favor of democracy, and all of his, statements about, like all of his past support of women's suffrage and, supporting women in their candidacy for office, and supporting women's rights in general. We ignore all of that, and we just compare him to Hitler. And we ignore the ways he tried to actively distance himself from racism, while at the same time courting the racist crowd, which was not wise of him. And then we ignore everything done by Churchill, which was very Hitlerian. And then we say, oh yeah, Mosley was the British Hitler, but Churchill wasn't. If Mosley was the British Hitler, then why wasn't Churchill also the British Hitler? Why don't we hold him to that same standard? Why is it that only Mosley has this reputation? Especially when Churchill himself was a fascist sympathizer who supported Mussolini. So this is just something to think about. Just something to think about in the bias in reporting. I'm no expert on these matters yet at this moment, but I am interested in these matters. And so I just wanted to make that clear. I wanted to make this video to talk about this because it was a subject that I was going over last night, and I think you'll find it very interesting.